"Ma'am, put your bag on the floor and step away from it now." The command echoed sharply across Terminal 3 at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, cutting through the steady rhythm of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and hurried conversations like a sudden crack across still water. Within seconds, dozens of travelers turned toward the sound. Parents stopped pushing strollers. Business travelers lowered their phones. Airline employees paused behind the boarding counter. An uneasy silence settled over Gate C-18 as curiosity spread faster than any announcement over the loudspeakers. Standing beside a weathered black leather carry-on was Dr. Ava Johnson, a 39-year-old black woman wearing a tailored charcoal business suit beneath a long navy overcoat. A worn leather briefcase rested beside her feet, its edges softened by years of travel rather than luxury. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. She wore no expensive jewelry, no government escort surrounded her, and no security detail cleared a path through the crowded terminal. She looked like countless professionals moving through American airports every morning, except for the remarkable calm that remained on her face while everyone else seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Officer Ryan Miller approached with measured confidence, his airport police uniform perfectly pressed beneath the bright terminal lighting. 12 years of airport security had taught him that hesitation sometimes created unnecessary risks. Only moments earlier, an automated verification alert had appeared on his handheld device after Ava's travel credentials failed to match the routine database used by airport officers. The system displayed only one message: additional verification required. Miller had seen similar alerts before. Most involved expired credentials, administrative errors, or travelers attempting to enter restricted areas using outdated documentation. Nothing about the situation seemed extraordinary until Ava calmly removed a slim leather credential wallet from her briefcase and placed it on top without being asked. "Officer," she said quietly, "everything you need is inside." Her voice carried neither fear nor frustration. She sounded like someone who had complete confidence that the truth would eventually arrive on its own. Miller opened the wallet carefully. The identification card appeared authentic. The photograph matched perfectly. Official seals reflected beneath the overhead lights with every expected security feature intact. Yet the clearance designation printed beneath her name immediately caught his attention. It did not resemble any identification he normally encountered. He looked back at Ava, then down again at the unfamiliar credential. "Where did you receive this?" he asked. "Through the agency that requested my travel," Ava answered simply. "If necessary, there is a verification number inside the folder." Miller barely acknowledged the suggestion. Behind him, another airport officer quietly stepped closer while transportation security personnel watched from nearby screening lanes. Several passengers whispered to one another, creating stories long before they possessed facts. Someone quietly lifted a phone toward the scene. Another traveler gently lowered it again after seeing the uneasy expressions around them. Through the enormous terminal windows, commercial aircraft taxied beneath a clear autumn sky while ground crews guided arriving planes toward distant gates. Everything outside continued moving exactly on schedule. Inside the terminal, time seemed strangely suspended. Ava folded her hands lightly in front of her briefcase and waited without complaint. She neither defended herself nor questioned the officers performing their duties. Years of professional responsibility had taught her that confidence rarely needed to become loud. Officer Miller closed the credential wallet and looked toward his partner. "We are going to need additional verification," he said firmly. "Ma'am, please come with us." Ava gave a small nod, picked up her briefcase, and followed without hesitation. She did not realize that only 2 concourses away, inside the airport's executive reception suite, a federal delegation had already delayed an important meeting because one distinguished guest had not yet arrived. Every few minutes another official checked the entrance doors, wondering why the woman they had traveled across the country to welcome had suddenly disappeared inside the very airport where they believed she had already landed. Officer Ryan Miller led Dr. Ava Johnson through a quiet service corridor away from the crowded departure gates, where the constant noise of the terminal faded into the distant hum of ventilation systems and rolling luggage. Fluorescent lights reflected softly across polished tile floors while airport employees passed by carrying supply carts without realizing that a misunderstanding was quietly unfolding only a few doors away. Ava walked beside the officers without resistance, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her weathered leather briefcase. She neither hurried nor slowed her pace. Her composure unsettled Miller more than any protest would have. Most travelers who found themselves pulled aside became anxious, frustrated, or defensive within minutes. Ava simply observed the hallway around her with calm curiosity, as though she trusted that patience would eventually accomplish what arguments never could. Inside a private verification office, Miller carefully placed her credential wallet, passport, boarding pass, and travel documents across a brushed metal table beneath bright overhead lights. Another airport officer began examining the contents of Ava's briefcase according to standard security procedures. Inside were neatly organized folders labeled with technical notes, a city library card tucked inside a hardcover notebook, a compact laptop, several engineering journals covered with handwritten calculations, and a framed photograph carefully wrapped inside a protective cloth sleeve. The younger officer removed the photograph gently and paused. It showed Ava standing beside an elderly woman wearing a nurse's uniform in front of a modest brick church, both smiling beneath blooming spring trees. Written across the back in blue ink were the words, "Never let kindness become optional. Love, Mom." The officer quietly returned the photograph exactly where he had found it before continuing the inspection. Miller remained focused on the identification documents spread before him. Every seal appeared genuine. Every printed code aligned perfectly. Yet the clearance designation displayed on his handheld verification device continued producing the same frustrating response. Authorization unavailable through standard network. Escalate verification. He folded his arms thoughtfully. "Dr. Johnson," he said, "what agency issued these credentials?" Ava answered without hesitation. "The office coordinating today's federal briefing." "Which office?" "The verification number inside the credential folder will provide that information." Miller glanced briefly toward the folder before looking back at her. "I would rather hear it from you." Ava nodded politely. "I understand." She said nothing further. The younger officer looked up from the briefcase. "Everything appears normal," he said quietly. Miller did not answer immediately. Something about the situation continued to trouble him. The documents looked authentic. Ava's explanations never changed. Her body language remained remarkably steady. Yet his experience told him to trust procedure above impressions. Outside the office window, passengers hurried toward departure gates while boarding announcements echoed faintly through the terminal ceiling. Life continued at its usual pace only a few hundred feet away. Inside the small verification room, every passing minute felt noticeably slower. Ava glanced once toward the wall clock. 11:23. She lowered her eyes again without saying a word. Miller noticed the movement. "Are you worried about missing your flight?" Ava offered a faint smile. "I am more concerned about people waiting than about airplanes." "Someone is expecting you?" Miller asked. "Several people," Ava replied quietly. "I would rather not keep them waiting." Her answer sounded unusually sincere, not dramatic. Before Miller could continue, his office telephone rang sharply across the room. He answered immediately. Airport Police Verification Office. The operations dispatcher spoke with unexpected urgency. "Ryan, have you finished with the traveler from gate C-18? Miller looked toward Ava. "Not yet." The dispatcher paused. "Executive reception just called again. A federal delegation keeps asking whether anyone has seen a guest who never arrived. They only gave one instruction. If you encounter a traveler carrying specialized federal credentials that do not appear in the regular database, contact executive operations immediately before making any final decision." Officer Ryan Miller slowly returned the telephone to its cradle, but the dispatcher's words remained echoing in his mind long after the call had ended. He looked through the glass partition toward Dr. Ava Johnson, who remained seated exactly where she had been since entering the verification office. Her weathered leather briefcase rested neatly beside her chair. Her hands were folded calmly in her lap. She had not asked to make a telephone call. She had not complained about the delay. She had not reminded anyone that she might be important. Instead, she simply waited with the quiet patience of someone who understood that truth often arrived more slowly than assumptions. Miller picked up the credential wallet once again and carefully examined the unfamiliar federal designation embossed beneath the official seal. Every security feature appeared flawless. Every signature matched authentic government formatting. Yet his verification device stubbornly displayed the same message. Escalation required. He looked toward the younger officer. Did you find anything unusual in her belongings? The younger officer shook his head. Nothing suspicious. Just technical journals, a laptop, travel documents, and personal items. Everything is organized better than most people pack for a business trip. Miller remained silent. Across the room, Ava quietly noticed the wall clock move another minute forward. 11:28. Somewhere else inside the airport, people she had never met were undoubtedly checking their watches for the same reason. Inside the executive reception suite overlooking the runways, a long conference table had been prepared with bottled water, briefing folders, and nameplates arranged with military precision. 3 senior federal officials stood near the panoramic windows watching aircraft arrive and depart while another quietly reviewed the morning itinerary. Any update? One of them asked. A transportation liaison lowered his phone with visible concern. No, sir. The airline confirms Dr. Ava Johnson boarded the shuttle from the parking garage and entered Terminal 3 on schedule. Then where is she? The room fell quiet. A senior official slowly closed the briefing folder bearing Ava's name across the cover. She has never missed an assignment in 12 years, he said. If she has not arrived, something prevented her from doing so. Back inside the airport verification office, Miller finally opened the credential folder beyond the identification card itself. Several neatly arranged documents rested inside. The first page contained travel authorization. The second contained emergency contact procedures. The third displayed a verification number printed in bold letters beneath the heading Immediate Federal Confirmation. Ava had mentioned the number twice already. Miller looked at it thoughtfully but hesitated. Procedure required supervisory approval before contacting unfamiliar federal agencies directly. He reached instead for his office radio. Operations. This is Officer Miller requesting supervisory assistance in Verification Room 2. A crackle answered immediately. Supervisor is occupied with executive coordination. Hold your position. Miller lowered the radio with quiet frustration. Ava looked toward him for the first time in several minutes. Officer, she said gently, if it helps, the number responds 24 hours a day. There was no impatience in her voice. Only a simple offer meant to make his job easier. Miller met her eyes for a brief moment before looking away again. Pride and procedure quietly wrestled inside his thoughts. Outside the office, airport employees hurried through brightly lit corridors while boarding announcements echoed overhead. Families embraced before departures. Flight crews rolled luggage toward waiting aircraft. The airport continued operating with remarkable precision, completely unaware that a single unanswered verification call had begun delaying events far beyond the terminal itself. Then, without warning, the office telephone rang again. Miller answered immediately. The dispatcher spoke faster than before. Ryan, Executive Operations just escalated the request. Federal officials are searching every terminal for one specific traveler. They have now provided a name. Miller instinctively reached for a pen. Go ahead. The dispatcher read slowly and clearly. Dr. Ava Johnson. The room became completely silent. Miller lowered his eyes toward the woman sitting only a few feet away. She simply looked back at him with the same calm expression she had carried since the beginning, as though she had known this moment would eventually arrive. Officer Ryan Miller remained standing beside the desk with the telephone still in his hand, his eyes fixed on Dr. Ava Johnson as though he were seeing her for the first time. The dispatcher's final words continued echoing through his thoughts. Federal officials were searching the entire airport for the very woman sitting quietly inside verification room 2. Yet procedure still demanded one final confirmation before any decision could change. Miller slowly placed the receiver back onto its cradle and opened the credential folder again. This time he turned directly to the second page where the emergency verification instructions had been printed from the beginning. The bold federal contact number rested there exactly where Ava had calmly pointed it out twice before. She watched him without satisfaction or disappointment. There was only patience. Miller finally reached for the office telephone and carefully entered each digit. The line connected before the second ring had finished. Federal Executive Coordination Center, a composed female voice answered. This line is monitored at all times. Miller introduced himself and explained the situation as professionally as he could. I am verifying the credentials of Dr. Ava Johnson. Her documents are not appearing through our standard system. The woman on the line asked only one question. Can you provide the authorization number printed beneath the federal seal? Miller read the number exactly as it appeared. The response came almost instantly. Confirmation complete. Dr. Ava Johnson is fully authorized for federal executive travel. She is currently expected by a senior interagency delegation meeting in your airport's executive reception suite. Please ensure she is escorted immediately. Miller closed his eyes for the briefest moment. The answer had been available from the beginning. All it had required was one telephone call. Across the room, Ava quietly picked up the framed photograph of her mother that had been returned to the table after the inspection. She carefully wiped away a faint fingerprint from the glass using the sleeve of her handkerchief before placing it gently back inside her briefcase. That small act somehow made the silence even heavier. The younger officer looked toward Miller. She was telling the truth the entire time. Miller answered quietly. Yes. Outside the verification office, activity inside Terminal 3 continued without interruption. Boarding groups formed beside departure gates. Children laughed while watching aircraft through the enormous glass windows. Flight attendants greeted passengers with practiced smiles. Only inside the small office had time seemed to stop. Suddenly another call came through the operations line. Miller answered immediately. Verification Room 2. The airport operations supervisor spoke with unusual urgency. Ryan, Executive Reception has confirmed the identification. Federal representatives are already on their way to your office. Miller looked toward Ava again. Understood. He ended the call and slowly gathered every document that had been spread across the desk. One by one he placed the passport, credential wallet, boarding pass, appointment folder, and travel authorization neatly back inside the leather briefcase exactly as they had originally been arranged. He carried the briefcase across the room himself before setting it carefully beside Ava's chair. Dr. Johnson, he said quietly, your belongings. Ava accepted the handle with a gentle nod. Thank you, officer. There was no anger hidden beneath her kindness. No quiet attempt to embarrass him. Only the same calm professionalism she had demonstrated since the first moment they met. Miller lowered his eyes briefly. I should have made that verification call sooner. Ava considered his words before answering. The important thing is that you made it. Before Miller could respond, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. Several airport administrators appeared beyond the glass partition, followed closely by two men in dark business suits wearing federal identification badges. Their pace was brisk, but their expressions carried something stronger than urgency. They carried unmistakable respect. As they reached the office doorway, the older of the two men looked inside, immediately recognized Ava, and his face relaxed with visible relief before he spoke the words that would change the atmosphere of the entire terminal. The older federal representative stepped into the verification office without hesitation, his expression shifting from concern to unmistakable relief the moment his eyes met Dr. Ava Johnson. "Dr. Johnson," he said warmly, extending his hand with genuine respect, "we have been looking for you throughout the terminal." Ava stood calmly and accepted the handshake with the same quiet professionalism she had shown all morning. "I apologize for the delay," she replied. "There was a misunderstanding during the verification process." The man smiled politely. "We are simply relieved that you are safe." He turned toward Officer Ryan Miller, offering a courteous nod before introducing himself. "My name is Thomas Reed. I serve as Executive Director for the Federal Advanced Infrastructure Council. Dr. Johnson is our keynote advisor for today's National Transportation Security Summit." The room fell completely silent. The younger airport officer slowly looked from Reed to Ava and then back again, trying to understand how the quiet traveler sitting patiently beside the metal table had become the center of an event involving senior federal leadership. Reed continued speaking without arrogance or criticism. "More than 80 federal, state, and aviation officials are waiting for Dr. Johnson's presentation. She is leading today's strategic discussion on the next generation of airport security systems." Officer Ryan Miller felt every assumption he had made that morning quietly collapse beneath the weight of simple facts. He remembered the worn leather briefcase, the aging travel bag, the calm voice, the verification number she had mentioned more than once, and the complete absence of frustration throughout the entire delay. None of those details had suggested the extraordinary responsibility she carried, yet every one of them had reflected the character of someone accustomed to solving problems rather than creating them. Reed noticed the expression on Miller's face and spoke gently. "Officer, I appreciate your commitment to public safety. Verification is important." He paused before adding with a respectful smile, "Dr. Johnson has always believed that careful verification protects everyone." Ava glanced toward Miller before quietly picking up the framed photograph of her mother once again. She carefully placed it back inside the briefcase, closed the brass clasp, and rested one hand lightly on the worn leather handle. The office remained completely still. No one rushed to leave. No one attempted to hurry the moment along. Outside the glass partition, airport supervisors and security personnel had quietly gathered in the hallway after hearing that federal representatives had arrived. Through the terminal windows, sunlight reflected brightly across parked aircraft while passengers continued moving toward departure gates, unaware that an important lesson about leadership and dignity had just unfolded only a few steps away. Reed looked toward the open office doorway. "Dr. Johnson, the delegation has delayed the opening session until your arrival. Your transportation is waiting." Ava nodded appreciatively. "Thank you." Before taking another step, she turned toward Officer Miller. He stood quietly beside the verification desk, still holding the report clipboard he had barely touched during the past several minutes. "Officer," Ava said softly, "thank you for returning my documents so carefully." Miller looked genuinely surprised. "Doctor, I should be thanking you for your patience." Ava smiled with quiet warmth. Patience becomes much easier when people are willing to seek the truth. Those simple words settled over the room with remarkable calm. There was no accusation hidden inside them. No attempt to remind anyone of authority or importance. Only a gentle reminder that every investigation deserved the same commitment to facts that it gave to suspicion. Reed stepped aside, allowing Ava to walk toward the hallway first. As she crossed the office threshold carrying her familiar leather briefcase, every airport employee waiting outside instinctively moved aside, not because anyone instructed them to do so, but because respect had quietly arrived long before any title had been spoken aloud. Thomas Reid led Dr. Ava Johnson through the quiet executive corridor connecting the airport operations wing to the private reception suite reserved for senior government delegations. The polished hallway was lined with large windows overlooking the runways where aircraft moved steadily beneath the bright midday sky. Every few steps another airport employee paused, recognizing Reid but looking curiously toward the woman walking beside him with nothing more than a weathered leather briefcase and a calm expression. Ava acknowledged each passing employee with the same polite smile she had offered everyone that morning, whether they wore executive suits, airline uniforms, or maintenance badges. She never hurried her pace. She never carried herself as though important people were waiting. Thomas Reid glanced toward her with quiet admiration. "Dr. Johnson," he said, "most people in your position would have been furious." Ava looked through the window as a passenger jet lifted gracefully from the runway before answering. Being angry would not have helped anyone understand what happened. Reid smiled faintly. "You have always believed that." Ava nodded gently. "People learn more from dignity than from embarrassment." Behind them, Officer Ryan Miller remained standing in the verification office long after the hallway had emptied. The room felt strangely different now. The same metal table remained beneath the fluorescent lights. The same office chair stood exactly where Ava had quietly waited. The same untouched paper cup of water still rested beside the chair. Yet the silence inside the room carried an entirely different meaning. Miller slowly picked up the empty credential folder once more, noticing the emergency verification number printed clearly on the second page. It had been visible from the very beginning. He remembered Ava mentioning it twice. He remembered choosing not to use it because he believed he already understood the situation. The realization settled heavily inside him. Across the terminal, the doors to the executive reception suite opened quietly as Reid and Ava entered together. More than 80 officials representing federal agencies, aviation authorities, transportation departments, and airport leadership immediately rose from their seats. Conversations ended without anyone asking for silence. At the front of the room stood a large presentation screen displaying the title National Aviation Security Leadership Summit. Several senior officials walked directly toward Ava, greeting her warmly with handshakes and genuine appreciation. "Dr. Johnson," one woman said with visible relief, "we delayed the opening session because your presentation is the foundation for today's discussions." Ava apologized softly for arriving late. None of the officials seemed concerned about the delay itself. They were simply grateful she had arrived safely. Reid quietly explained that an unexpected verification misunderstanding had occurred during airport security procedures. Several people looked surprised but quickly returned their attention to Ava, treating the incident as an unfortunate delay rather than a defining moment. Meanwhile, back inside verification room 2, the younger airport officer quietly entered carrying the incident report clipboard. He looked toward Miller. "Are you all right?" Miller gave a thoughtful nod. "I will be." He reached for his pen and carefully crossed out the first conclusion he had written near the top of the report. Beneath it he slowly wrote a new sentence. "Verification should begin before judgment is complete." He read the words twice before placing the clipboard aside. Through the office window he could see travelers continuing toward their gates, each carrying bags, stories, responsibilities, and destinations invisible to everyone around them. For the first time in many years, he realized how easily appearances invited assumptions and how quietly truth often waited for someone willing to ask one more question. Far above the busy terminal, sunlight reflected across the airport control tower while another aircraft climbed into the blue afternoon sky, and somewhere beyond the glass walls of the executive conference suite, Dr. Ava Johnson prepared to speak about building safer airports by strengthening systems designed to protect every traveler equally, unaware that the most important lesson of the day had already begun changing one officer's understanding of what true security was meant to protect. When Thomas Reid finished introducing Dr. Ava Johnson, the conference room settled into complete silence, not because anyone had been instructed to stop talking, but because every person present understood they were about to hear someone whose work had quietly influenced airport security across the country for years. Ava walked toward the podium carrying the same weathered leather briefcase that had followed her through countless terminals, conference halls, and engineering sites. She placed it gently beside the podium before removing a slim folder and a small presentation remote. The large screen behind her illuminated with a simple title: Building Trust into Security Systems. No dramatic graphics. No impressive slogans. Just 7 carefully chosen words. Ava looked around the room, meeting the eyes of aviation executives, federal administrators, transportation specialists, and senior security leaders. "Good afternoon," she began softly. "Thank you for waiting." Her voice carried naturally throughout the room without needing microphones to command attention. "Before we discuss technology, I would like to remind all of us why technology exists." The audience listened without moving. "Every security system we create is designed to protect people," she continued. "If those systems lose sight of the people they are protecting, then even the most advanced technology begins losing its purpose." Several officials quietly nodded. Thomas Red watched with a faint smile. He had heard Ava speak before, yet her ability to simplify complicated ideas into human truths always carried remarkable weight. She advanced to the next slide, displaying an image of an ordinary airport terminal filled with travelers from every background imaginable. "Every person walking through an airport carries something invisible," Ava said. "Responsibilities. Families. Dreams. Fear. Grief. Hope. None of those things appear on an identification card. Yet every one of them deserves the same dignity while we perform our responsibilities." Her words echoed through the room with quiet conviction. Nobody interrupted. Nobody reached for a telephone. Every notebook remained open while pens rested motionless. Downstairs inside Verification Room 2, Officer Ryan Miller quietly completed the final section of the incident report before setting his pen aside. Instead of filing it immediately, he opened the airport's internal training manual resting on a nearby shelf. He slowly turned to the chapter covering identity verification procedures and carefully reread every instruction from beginning to end. For years he had believed experience alone made him efficient. Today had reminded him that experience without humility could become another form of assumption. The younger officer entered carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. He placed one beside Miller without speaking. After a moment he asked quietly, "Would you handle it differently now?" Miller looked toward the office window where travelers continued crossing the terminal beneath bright afternoon sunlight. "I would begin with verification," he answered. "Not with certainty." Upstairs, Ava concluded her presentation with a single photograph displayed across the screen. It showed 2 airport employees helping an elderly traveler find the correct departure gate. There were no expensive machines visible. No sophisticated equipment. Only simple human kindness. "The strongest security systems," she said gently, "will always depend on people who remember that procedures and respect belong together." The room remained silent for several seconds after she finished speaking. Then every person slowly rose to their feet. The applause that followed was not loud or theatrical. It was steady, sincere, and deeply respectful. Ava smiled modestly before thanking everyone once more. She never mentioned the misunderstanding that had delayed her arrival. She never spoke about the verification office, the waiting room, or the assumptions that had nearly prevented her from standing where she was. Those details no longer mattered. The lesson had already reached exactly the people who needed to learn it most, and somewhere 1 floor below, an airport police officer quietly realized that the greatest moment of his career would never be remembered for the mistake he made that morning, but for the person who chose to answer it with grace instead of resentment. The conference hall slowly returned to quiet conversation as federal officials gathered around Dr. Ava Johnson, thanking her personally for the presentation that had transformed a technical summit into something far more meaningful. Instead of discussing software architecture or security algorithms, many found themselves talking about trust, patience, and the responsibility carried by every person wearing a badge or an identification card. Ava accepted every compliment with the same gentle humility she had shown throughout the day. She never described the misunderstanding that had delayed her arrival in dramatic terms. She simply answered questions, listened carefully, and smiled whenever someone thanked her for reminding them that security should always begin with respect for people. As the afternoon session concluded, Thomas Red walked beside her toward the executive elevator. "Dr. Johnson," he said quietly, "the airport director would like to meet you before you leave." Ava nodded politely. "Of course." Several minutes later, they stepped into the airport director's office overlooking the runways. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, aircraft taxied beneath the bright afternoon sky while travelers continued moving through the terminals below, unaware that a conversation inside the executive offices would quietly influence the future of airport operations. Airport Director Margaret Collins welcomed Ava warmly before turning toward Officer Ryan Miller, who had been invited upstairs at her request. Miller entered with measured steps, his uniform as neat as ever, but his expression carried none of the certainty that had filled it earlier that morning. He stopped several feet away from Ava and stood silently for a moment before speaking. "Dr. Johnson," he said, "I owe you a sincere apology." Ava looked at him with calm attention. "You have already apologized once." Miller slowly nodded. "Yes, but this time I understand why." The room remained completely still. "I believed experience had taught me how to recognize risk," he continued. "Today reminded me that experience can never replace careful verification, and assumptions can never replace facts." Ava listened without interruption. There was no satisfaction in her eyes. Only understanding. Miller took a slow breath before continuing. "You gave me every opportunity to verify your identity. You remained respectful when you had every reason not to be. I will remember that for the rest of my career." Ava smiled gently. Then today was not wasted. Director Collins quietly folded her hands. "Dr. Johnson," she asked, "is there anything you would like this airport to do in response to what happened?" Thomas Reed glanced toward Ava, already expecting her answer. She looked briefly through the window at passengers crossing the terminal far below before speaking. "I would not ask for punishment." Miller lowered his eyes. Ava continued softly, "I would ask for one improvement." Director Collins nodded. "Please tell us." Ava answered without hesitation. "Teach every new officer that verification is strongest when it begins with curiosity instead of certainty. Procedures protect airports. Respect protects people. We need both." No one spoke for several seconds after she finished. The simplicity of her words somehow carried greater authority than any formal recommendation could have. Director Collins finally smiled. "We can do that." Miller looked toward Ava once more. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not for overlooking my mistake, but for showing me how to become better because of it." Ava picked up her weathered leather briefcase and gently adjusted the framed photograph inside before closing the brass clasp. "Every person has a difficult day," she replied. "The important question is whether that day becomes a wall or a doorway." As they walked together toward the executive hallway, warm afternoon sunlight reflected across the polished floor while another aircraft lifted smoothly into the clear blue sky beyond the windows, and the quiet lesson that had begun inside a small verification office continued spreading through the airport without anyone needing to raise their voice. Late afternoon sunlight poured through the towering glass walls of Terminal 3, covering the polished floors with long bands of warm golden light as the airport gradually settled into its familiar rhythm once again. Boarding announcements echoed softly through the concourses. Families embraced before departures. Flight crews rolled their luggage toward waiting aircraft while business travelers hurried between terminals, unaware that one quiet encounter earlier that day had already begun changing the way people inside the airport viewed their responsibilities. Dr. Ava Johnson walked calmly through the executive corridor carrying the same weathered leather briefcase that had accompanied her for years. Nothing about her appearance had changed since that morning. She still wore the same charcoal business suit beneath her navy overcoat. She still carried the same framed photograph of her mother safely inside her briefcase. The only difference was invisible. The people around her now understood who she was, yet she carried herself exactly as she had before anyone recognized her name. Thomas Red accompanied her toward the departure gate reserved for federal travelers. Before reaching the security doors, Ava paused briefly to look through the large terminal windows where aircraft lined the taxiways beneath the bright afternoon sky. She smiled quietly, not because the difficult morning had ended, but because kindness had survived it. Several weeks later, Officer Ryan Miller stood inside the same verification office preparing a newly assigned airport officer for his first day of duty. The office looked exactly as it had before. The same brushed metal table stood beneath the fluorescent lights. The same verification manuals rested neatly on the shelf. The same office telephone waited beside the computer terminal. Yet one important addition had appeared. Framed beside the verification procedures hung a simple printed reminder approved by airport leadership after the federal summit. Verify completely. Listen respectfully. Judge carefully. The young officer looked at the sign before asking, "Who wrote that?" Miller smiled faintly. "Someone who reminded all of us why we wear this uniform." He never mentioned Ava's name. He did not need to. The lesson had become larger than one person. Every new officer entering the airport would now begin training with those words. Across the country, Dr. Ava Johnson continued traveling from city to city, helping airports improve security systems that protected millions of travelers every year. She still preferred ordinary flights instead of private transportation whenever possible. She still carried the same weathered leather briefcase. She still paused before each trip to read the handwritten message on the back of her mother's photograph. Never let kindness become optional. Love, Mom. Those words remained her quiet compass long after conferences ended and presentations faded from memory. Months later, Officer Miller happened to notice an elderly traveler struggling to understand a confusing boarding change near the security checkpoint. Instead of simply pointing toward another counter, he walked beside the traveler until the correct gate appeared on the departure screen. The grateful man smiled warmly before continuing on his journey. As Miller returned to his post, he caught his own reflection in the terminal window and realized something important. Real authority had never come from deciding quickly. It came from caring enough to understand completely. Outside, another aircraft rose gracefully above the Chicago skyline, disappearing into the clear blue horizon while sunlight reflected across its silver wings. Inside the terminal, travelers continued carrying dreams, worries, responsibilities, and stories invisible to everyone around them. Some would be recognized immediately. Others would not. Yet every one of them deserved to be treated with the same dignity. Dr. Ava Johnson disappeared into the moving crowd without seeking attention, leaving behind no headlines, no celebration, and no public recognition. She left something far more lasting. A quiet reminder that the strongest security begins with humanity, the greatest leadership begins with humility, and the most powerful identity any person can carry is the character they choose to show before anyone learns their name.